Good afternoon, friends. It's Thursdays in Black, time for my daily reflection. Please remember that Thursdays in Black is an ELCA position in association with other Christian congregations and denominations as we stand against the concept of human trafficking. It needs to stop, and we need to be aware of what's going on. In the last week or so, I've had a couple of conversations with people here in Vacaville and in surrounding areas, reflecting on their stories of the firestorm, the LNU fire complex that has raged through here. To give you an update for those of you watching from elsewhere, we're at about 75 to 80% contained. That's good news. From a fire that broke out on Wednesday, what majorly broke out for us on Wednesday, August 19th. Those of us who were in the area knew about evacuation orders at various times during the day. Some evacuated, some didn't. Some went back to homes right away when the evacuation orders ended. Others stayed away from homes for a period of time. Some were not able to go home to homes. You know, the Lacanari family of our congregation lost their home in the early days, early hours perhaps even, of that fire. But it's those folks who have returned home, who have shared with me their own sense of frustration, anger, guilt, that they were survivors and they had little to no damage to their homes, and they feel really bad about everybody else having problems. I've used a phrase from time to time about grief not being a competition, pain and loss not being a competition. So let me give you a background story of how it came to be my mantra. In 1991, we had an event here in the Bay Area called either the Oakland Hills Fire, the East Bay Hills Fire, the Oakland Firestorm. It was any number of a couple of names. It occurred in October of 1991. Now, Alex and I had finished church in Santa Rosa. We drove over to Napa to watch the seniors play at Silverado Golf Course. And as we were going around, we had no clue what was happening in the rest of the world until we were walking up the 18th fairway following whatever group we were following. And I noticed off to the side, people in the condos or townhouses or hotel rooms or whatever they were over there, everybody had their TV set on. And all the TVs were talking about a fire. It was the Oakland Hills fire. I remember Alex asking me, "Are we safe?" And I said yes. In order for the fire to get to us, either in Napa or when we drove home to Santa Rosa, it would have to cross major waterways, would be safe. We were. And about 3 days later, the fire was under control and or out. And it was at that time that some of the people that I knew who lived in that area started talking about their stories. One of them was a couple who lived up in the hills. He had an extensive collection of antique books. I think they were probably all theological books, church-related. And when the storm started, he started packing up. They got out as much as they could, and then they left. They were afraid for their lives. They wondered what kind of a home they would return to. When it was all said and done and they returned home, theirs was the only house that stood on the block. He began to have survivor guilt. He wondered why it was that his house was spared while his neighbors and friends were not so lucky. He admitted that he went into a deep funk over that for a period of time. And it was a couple of years later, probably 2 or 3 even, when we happened to be sitting together having lunch with a bunch of other friends, and we were all talking about stuff, when Victor shared with me, "My counselor gave me some really good insight the other day." And I said, "What?" First of all, it was a surprise that he was going to a counselor. Not that that's a bad thing, but Victor was always one of those people who was going to do it on his own. That was his mentality. And I said, "Well, what is it that your counselor said to you that has flipped a switch in your mind?" And he said simply, I was reminded that grief is not a competitive sport. My grief is real, and it's real to me. And my neighbor's grief is real, and it's real to them. My loss is real to me, and their loss is real to them. And I don't have to compare my loss and my grief to their loss and their grief, because it's just not good. You know, that just sort of sat with me for a day or two. I never thought too much about it, other than it sounded like a really good expression to use at some point. And then it became more of a mantra as I recognized around me that friends were experiencing disasters, frustrations, loss, grief, and I wasn't sharing in it. I wasn't experiencing the same things. I wasn't experiencing things like divorce or death. And I kept saying to myself, this is not a competitive sport. Theirs is real. So too is mine. I used that phrase that grief and loss is not a competitive sport when I did a reflection, I think it was on the Tuesday after the fire. It reminded me that indeed, the fact that I came home to an awfully smoky environment, but no damage to my house, my street, my neighbors, my friends, it didn't mean that it didn't happen. And it didn't mean that I couldn't be compassionate toward others. It just reminded me that their loss was their loss. And as bad as it was, I didn't have to feel guilty about not experiencing it. In compassion, one can certainly feel for the other person. We care about another person. We may have anxiety about how they're going to put life back together again. And perhaps the best way that we who have survived and been unaffected by that loss is to listen more deeply to the words and the expressions. When I visited with Rebecca and Aiden a week ago tomorrow, I listened as they told me about what it meant. Yes, Rebecca, and yes, Aiden got emotional. It was hard to talk at times. But I've learned that allowing people to speak, to not have to finish answers for them, to not have to finish sentences for people is important. It's part of who we are. So for those of us who have not joined the club that Rebecca, Jeff, Luke, and Aiden are now part of, the best way we can respond to them is listening. Hear what they say. I mean, really hear what they say when they're frustrated and angry and disappointed. When people say things like, we never got a warning, the best answer for us or best response from us should be, oh. Don't try to rationalize. That's not helpful. Just listen. Maybe hard. But think about that in terms of other moments too. It's not just at the loss of a home through fire, but think of the times that you may have been involved with someone who wants to share with you the loss that they've experienced because of the death of a spouse, and you've not experienced that. What do you say? Importantly, words like, oh, and not answering questions because nobody's got the answers. We don't have to be in competition with one another. That somehow or other my loss, my grief, my frustration, my anger needs to be bigger and better and more. I've understood what Victor's phrase to me was. I own what is my loss. I own what is my grief. I own what is my frustration. And it doesn't have to be equal or greater than anybody else's, because their grief their loss, their struggle is theirs. But as a partner in Christ, as a fellow believer, as a journeyer through this world with God beside us, all we're called to do is walk beside. I hope that helps those of you who are wondering and maybe debating what were you doing right and why didn't the others whom you love and like didn't survive stuff. It has nothing to do, I think, with that. It's us trying to make it a competition. It's not. Hey, I look forward to seeing you on Sunday. And this Sunday, it will be parking lot worship for us here at Shepherd of the Hills. So I suspect there'll be quite a few people parked in our parking lot. And of course, I know that you will all do those important pieces. You'll maintain safe physical distance. If you're outside of your car listening, please make sure you're wearing your mask. I'm thanking God that the air quality has certainly improved tremendously in the last 3 days. So until we see each other on Sunday, no reflection tomorrow, I'm taking the day off. Remember, please wash your hands a couple times a day, 20 seconds at a time. Put on that hand lotion to make them nice and soft. Stay home if you're not feeling well, especially on Sunday. Love one another. Don't get caught in a competition with one another. Maintain that 6-foot distance between you and others, unless you're family members, and then hug the daylights out of each other. Wear that mask, and please, 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 as Sergeant Esterhaus dismisses us to our ministerial rounds, be careful out there.